significant influence for me, as for so many, was my mother. My mother was a pianist who probably could have or would have gone on to a career, but she got married when she was 19. And she was a piano teacher. She taught piano until she was 90 years old. All my life growing up, my mother was a piano teacher, and she was my first teacher. And my older brother and sister were playing. I started playing by ear. My mother realized early on that I couldn't stay with her, not so much because I was too good, but because the discipline. I cannot remember a time in my life that music wasn't my great love. And if someone were to ask me, when did you decide to become a musician? I would answer, really, when I decided to have brown eyes. I didn't decide to be a musician. It's just I am. It's my conscious of myself. But it's when we moved to Dallas. My mother was from that part. I grew up in Arizona before, but when I was 11, and I went to study with Alexander Uninsky. Uninsky was a great pianist who had won the Chopin competition back in 32 and taught at Juilliard in the 50s, but had terrible arthritis and had kind of semi-retired. And really, I think he had one of the very first artist in residence positions, like this sort of, which now is a common thing, at SMU in Dallas. And so it was one of the factors why our family moved there, actually. And I started studying with him. And that's when he was an enormous influence on me. In one way, because that's when I learned about discipline. I was on my own. I wasn't living at home. I was a boarder at school. He was not a teacher who would yell at me. If I didn't practice, he'd send me home. And so I had to decide when I was 12 years old, basically, that I was going to practice. I was going to get up at 5 in the morning and practice every day, very, very, rigorously, because it was me, because it was my duty to myself, to my talent. And I think that's a incomparably important transformative thing, that the discipline has to come with him, at least for me. And also, one of the things with Uninsky that left, he was by far the most important teacher I had. Uninsky was somebody who very strongly believed that pianists are not just piano players. The pianists are musicians, and musicians are artists, and artists are soldiers in the war of culture, that we are representatives of an ongoing part of the human experience that leaves its imprint on history and on mankind, and that we do our best as more we understand ourselves as part of something bigger. And that's true of each individual piece. So with Uninsky, if I studied a Chopin Ballade or if I studied a Beethoven Sonata, I had to know about Chopin and about Beethoven, not about their personal lives, but about what was happening in the world when they lived. Who were they writing for? Basic scope, the context. When a student starts working a piece with me, or when I start working a piece with myself, the very first thing I try to figure out is, what is this piece trying to do? What is the composer trying to do with this piece? Rather than immediately start figuring out the hard passages and how I'm going to finger them or what hand position I'm going to use. I'm really more interested, and always have been more interested in that aspect, rather than sort of the nuts and bolts are necessary. Without the nuts and bolts, of course, we can't bring the music to life. If you don't figure out good fingerings and practice and then all the knowledge is useless. But the knowledge is useful insofar as it helps us get into the skin of the composer and really understand her or his what they're trying to say, so we can speak for them. So that was an enormous impact. Well, another thing was important for me. Uninsky was a contest winner. He was the winner of the second Chopin competition in Warsaw. So he didn't forbid me from doing competitions, but very on, he made it very clear that competitions were important, but only for practical reasons. You weren't any better because you won, nor any worse because you didn't. And he never let me enter more than one competition a year. And back in those days, I always won everything. And I went to Juilliard. He sent me away to Juilliard when I was 17. And I studied there with Beveridge Webster for my bachelor's and master's. And during that time, I went to my first international competition when I was 18, which was in Warsaw, the Chopin competition. I didn't win, but I had a lot of success and started playing a lot of concerts because of it. And then I won gold medal in the Queen Elizabeth competition in 1972, which was important, although less important than I thought it would be. I won Young Concert Artists here in New York in 1974. That was very, very important. And then I won this competition in Milan in 1975 at La Scala, which I didn't want to do, which I was kind of invited to go. And at the last minute I went because the jury was Martha Argerich, Maurizio Pollini, Claudio Abbado, Vyacheslav Varshovsky, Annie Fisher. And it's because this pianist, Dino Ciani, very young, brilliant, obviously extremely charismatic young man, died in an automobile accident at 32. And there was a huge sort of outpouring of sympathy and love. And so they created this competition at La Scala. And it went on actually until 1999. And there were some other wonderful winners. Andrea Lucazzini, Claudio Martinez Maynor, I mean, people who went on to good careers, David Lively. But the first one was just, I mean, there was like 5 pages coverage in every day in the newspaper. And it was a really big deal. It had a very, very big impact on my career afterwards. From the age of 21, basically, I've made a living as a concert pianist with a lot of probably, especially since the mid 80s, more in Europe than in the States for various reasons.
You're teaching students, then you're a performer and you have certain ways, for instance, yourself being cultured, a person like you, the language, and then, all the knowledge and put it together. Then you look at this young generation, do you feel there's a gap?
I really do. And I think there's sort of an irony, a paradox, because in my generation, in order to find out what all these words, if a composer happened to write indications on the score in French or in German as opposed to in Italian, in my generation, you had to actually buy the Harvard Dictionary of Music. You had to go to effort to find out what these words meant. Whereas today, we just on our phones, we can find out in a second what anything means in just any language. And yet I find extraordinarily commonly today that students don't know what the words mean. I mean, even not even necessarily even the German or French ones, the Italian ones, and words that occur very commonly. But something else, which is probably much more important than just knowing what the words mean, it's so much easier to know something about the pieces that you're playing. Just look, I mean, Wikipedia is very weak, but it's something. And the only reason I know it's weak is because if I read a Wikipedia article about something I don't know anything about, I take it as authoritative. If I read it about something I do know something about, I say, oh, this is superficial, this is outdated, that's just, but still it's something. I mean, it's easy to find things about anything. And I feel that what's lacking is the curiosity. I remember that when I was a kid, if I was learning a Chopin ballade, let's say that my teacher, the first one I learned, the third ballade, well, immediately I start sight reading all the other 3 because it's there in the book. And it's what's amazing to me now is the number of students I have who are learning pieces from a volume and they've never looked at any of the other pieces in the volume. It's just sort of a general lack of curiosity. I think, though, that the fault lies with this culture we live in to some extent, the superficiality of it, changing channels all the time, but also with the teachers. It's the teacher's job to stimulate the students' curiosity. There's nothing as important for a student as to be inspired, encouraged, led to become curious, because out of curiosity we grow, in all respects. So I think that that is a big challenge for teaching, and it's one that I found. And one, by the way, it's by no means. There's a terrible stereotype, racist stereotype somehow, that our students of European background start with kind of a head start because they have more background into the culture. Since most of the music we play is written by European composers, they have a head start into the background of what that culture is. And I don't find that to be true necessarily at all. I think it's very individual that there are European students who seem to know nothing whatsoever about the composers they're playing, and others who know a great deal. And there are students who come to New York and are dying to go to the opera and to hear string quartets and to go to the Metropolitan Museum, and et cetera, et cetera. And they could come from anywhere in the world, and there are other ones coming from, Italy, who don't want to go to a museum. That's pretty rare. I have to say, Italians, museums are part of their life. But I do think, and that's something that I do as a teacher, and I know that many of my colleagues do, is I try as hard as possible to encourage my students to go to the museum, go to concerts, hear string quartets, hear operas, hear symphonies, hear obviously other pianists. It's for many, many reasons. But the most important reason is to grow as a human being, to grow, sort of become, you sort of cultivate your garden, and you have more to draw from. But I remember when I played 110, practically the first thing Ms. Juninsky said to me, says, Beethoven wrote this piece at the same time as he wrote a huge piece, which is central to this period of his life, which is the Missa Solemnis. He says, if you want to understand 110, you have to understand the Missa Solemnis. Now, hearing the Musicale, this was in 1968. Let's say. Um, that wasn't so easy. I mean, I didn't have money. The records were expensive. I didn't have a record player really of my own. I had a friend, but eventually I managed to do it, and I managed to get a hold of a score. The possibilities are so fantastic today, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people take advantage of them.
Do you see this kind of a gap in show up in their performances of their
Absolutely,
playing?
absolutely. That is the Isabel is the real question, and it's not an easy question to answer in any kind of sort of simple quantitative way. First thing I think stylistically, if you don't, for instance, know that in late Beethoven he's becoming really, really fascinated with um, voice leading, with the possibilities of he writes about it over and over and over again, and that's probably one of the reasons he goes. The string quartet is the perfect medium for that because of the interplay of four voices. So Beethoven becomes extremely interested in polyphony. Yes, he writes a lot of fugues, which he hadn't done, but it's not just in the fugal movements. You have to think polyphonically about all. So the okay, 110 has two fugues in it, or but the first movement is also very polyphonic, or polyphonic in the way of the voice, the voice movement, the interaction of the voices, and in a very different kind of way, but nevertheless, and a student who doesn't know that or doesn't grasp that is going to miss a very important part of it. And also, I think, I guess almost all students have some kind of understanding that of Beethoven's isolation, and sort of as he's moving more and more inward in that period, but that the inwardness and things like that, and what does he mean by una corda when he starts writing in the late period, all these una corda? What does that actually translate to? For that matter, what does he mean by, and all through his middle period too, his pedal indications? What does he mean by that? I think it's such an easy thing for people to do, say, his piano's different, and just simply ignore it, and which would be tantamount to saying his piano's different, let's ignore forte, or his piano's different, let's ignore staccato. You know, people don't usually, hopefully, ignore staccato or forte, but they ignore pedal just, and I'm not saying necessarily to do it, but I'm saying you have to take it very carefully into consideration and try to do ultimately what we try to do with everything when we play, whether it's Haydn who we're talking about, or Shostakovich. What is the composer trying to say? Why does the composer write what she or he writes? One of the great mysteries of music. I remember the first time I went to China, um, I judged a competition, a national competition, and there were these kids, also young ages. There were these 13, 14-year-old kids from really the hinterlands. They had practically no knowledge or understanding of anything having to do with the history of Western music. But some of them played with real sensitivity. Now, there was a lot to learn, but this basic sensitivity, that's kind of a mystery. I mean, the feeling for instance, which harmonies are more pungent, which harmonies are more urgent, which harmonies are more ambiguous, which harmonies are more at rest, how the phrase, all those kinds of things. Ultimately, teachers can't teach those things really. They can just kind of make students try to make students aware of them, and the student has to feel it. But the miracle of music is students do feel it, even students without any background. But that doesn't mean that. So obviously, there have been people who play, and there have been people who play great in a certain kind of way, a certain kind of repertoire, without any kind of real cultural background. But I think by and large, anybody gains. I'm sort of a believer in I guess to me, an ideal kind of pianist would be Rubinstein, who was really someone who had this large humanity and grasp of culture in a very, very broad sense. And
That's a great point for these young musicians. Majority of them don't even have access to good theory classes where music
now
history.
that's, of course, a whole other issue. Yes, I'm glad that, if you don't mind, I'm going to address that for just a
Sure.
second. Because in the old days, these disciplines were done extremely academically, extremely rigidly, and without any sense of context. Today, they're simply not done at all, or done so superficially that the student has almost no knowledge of it. There's two reasons why I think it's so important that students do study these things. One is much more important than the other. The one that's not so important is because the composers did. If we're trying to get into the composer's skin, mind, creativity, whether it be Bach or Debussy, both Bach and Debussy rigorously studied harmony and counterpoint and voice leading and these things. And it completely conditioned their own way of thinking about music. So if we're going to think like they do, then we have to have some of the equipment they had. But the other reason is because, and this is, I think, the fault also of the way these things are taught. Um, See, I'm extremely interested about harmony, and I talk about harmony a great deal in lessons. But I'm not interested in harmony in terms of what's a German sixth and what's a Neapolitan sixth, etc. The names and things like that, those are probably necessary when we study. Uh, but what I am interested in is how harmony functions to create musical lines, for instance, and all the time. What is a dominant? What does it mean? What is a secondary dominant? What does it do? What are the degrees of tension in secondary dominance? All this kind of thing. And I scream at my students constantly about this stuff, but not because of the names. And the same thing is true with sonata form or any of the forms. I think, sure, I guess at some point they all study kind of this, and this is very, very, very much to the heart of my particular subject here, which is Haydn. I think they have a gross misunderstanding of sonata form because they've learned it as some kind of schematic rule thing where you have the first theme and this transition and then the second theme and then this transition and maybe a closing theme in codetta, and this, it's all really, and of course the problem is that those schemes were made up by people 50 years after sonata form written like this was out of vogue, and it's in the middle of the 19th century, and that the creators of sonata form, and Haydn is the most important, didn't think of it that way at all. And if we look at Haydn's, whatever it is, piano sonata 60 something or 90 string quartets or whatever that is, or 104 symphonies, I mean, every one of them has at least one, and many have many movements in sonata form. And yet he never does anything the same twice. So the important thing is to understand, what is he trying to do? What is why do composers write? Why did they develop sonata form? What were the advantages of sonata forms? Bach did perfectly well. He never has anything even vaguely like sonata form. So why did they feel the need to do this? What was the purpose? What was the advantages? If we don't understand that, then how can we as performers realize what they're trying to do? And so the idea of closed forms versus open forms, that's my own words. Closed forms being forms where the time is defined, and that what it's organized as a whole. So the experience of a certain piece or movement or whatever is in theory, you couldn't change the order of events or take something out or add something without radically changing the whole meaning of the piece, as opposed to open forms like variations or like almost anything in Bach, where if you needed to, I'm sure if Bach had ever come to a gig and the guy had said, "Oh, Herr Bach, the guy before you canceled, so we need your piece to be 10 minutes longer," he could have added 10 minutes just by or taken out by improvising or adding more episodes or things like that, because that's the way that those pieces are organized. It's a different idea of time and pieces. But once you get to sonata form, or all the various forms like sonata forms, and Haydn almost invariably, Haydn wrote variations too, but that's a less important part of his works. And that's true of Mozart and Beethoven. And really, I mean, Beethoven at the end of his life, no, that's not true. But of composers through the 19th century, they're interested in a different kind of form, and what I call a narrative form, but one that has a sense of closed time. And of all of those, the one that was the most successful for the longest time is sonata form. And it's what the important thing for the student is not to learn the rules of it, but to learn how it works and what's it trying to do. And so I think that this goes back again to theory teachers again. Just as they don't teach harmony, they teach a bunch of names and not how it works for performers. I think that with form, they learn a bunch of names and so-called rules, but not how it works and what composers are trying to do. As you can see, rather strong feelings about that.